Good morning, church family. Hope so far you've had a great weekend. Anyone have any issues over the weekend? None? That's great. Last week, we began to discuss Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, where Abram, Sarai, and Lot enter into the land of Canaan, and they settled temporarily at a place called Shechem. We didn't finish with those discussions, so we'll continue there this week. There we go. This is the verse that we settled on last week. I'll read it briefly. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. We talked briefly, this is the NIV, and we talked briefly that the NIV is the only English version that I'm aware of. Batteries, huh? Oh, it died. I'll try to be loud enough. Use my military command voice. We talked a little bit about the NIV being the only English version that uses the word great tree, that other English versions use either an oak tree or a terebinth tree. Some English versions use the term plains. And I mentioned last week that based on plains and the Hebrew definition of Moreh being instruction, I prefer the translation, plains of instruction. Shechem. Oh, now I don't have to shout anymore. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Okay. I showed this map a little bit briefly last week just to give you a rough idea where Shechem is in relation to everything else. This is the Dead Sea, and this is the Sea of Galilee. This is Israel. Jerusalem's right here, and Shechem is just north, right here. I think it's 30 miles north of Jerusalem. So we're in what would have been called Samaria at the time that Jesus walked through the area. Shechem is situated in a narrow valley separating Mount Ebal to the north and Mount Gerizim to the south. The valley was a principal highway for merchants and travelers moving between northern and southern Israel. Shechem's placement in this crucial trade route gave it economic importance. Showed this picture last week of what I've titled the Plains of Moreh. The city in the valley there is Nablus, the modern-day city of Nablus. Mount Ebal is on the right, and Mount Gerizim is on the left. And that east-west, north-south passageway goes right through, right in between the two. Anything else I need to talk about here? We reviewed several important biblical events that occurred at Shechem. Each of these events had in common that promises were either made, broken, fulfilled, all of them at Shechem. Specifically, God's promises were made and kept. Man's promises were made but not usually kept. We also started to talk about the secular history of Shechem and how it fits in with the biblical events, but we didn't finish. We talked about the Amarna letters that were found in Egypt. These were correspondence between the Pharaoh of Egypt and the various city rulers in Canaan. The topics of many of these letters concern the invasion of a group called the Habaru, which many archaeologists contend refers to the Hebrew conquest of Canaan led by Joshua. And that's where we left off. So we were going through the history of Shechem, and we left off with the Amarna letters. So the Amarna letters tell us that the king or the mayor of Shechem was a guy named Labayu, and apparently he was favorable to the Israelites. There was no battle mentioned in the Amarna letters, and there's no battle mentioned in the Bible about the Israelites having to take Shechem. And in fact, in Judges, there's a description where the residents of Shechem are joining the Israelites in the reading of the law that happened on Mounts Gerizim and Ebal. The biblical timeline places the start of the conquest of Canaan by Joshua and the Israelites at about 1406 BC. The Bible doesn't tell us how long this campaign lasted. However, the book of Judges tells us that the campaign was still ongoing after Joshua's death at 110 years and well into the next generation. Assuming that Joshua was about 60 years old when the campaign started, and that 60 came about because he was one of the spies that went into the land. He came back out. He was probably about 20 at that time. Then they spent 40 years in the desert, so approximately 60. So that campaign would have lasted at least 50 years till the death of Joshua, and then another generation. So let's say a minimum of 70 years, and probably much longer. Nevertheless, the Bible timeline, along with the Amarna letters, tell us that Shechem was a thriving city at the time that Israel conquest of Canaan. The Amarna letters also tell us that the ruler of Shechem sided with the Israelites and aided them. Archaeology confirms the absence of a destruction layer during this time frame. Archaeologists discovered a destruction layer dating to the late 12th century BC, or about 1125 to 1100 BC. This is roughly 300 years after the start of the conquest of Canaan and in the middle of the Judges period. They found signs of burning within the inner chambers of the temple specifically. The site was apparently abandoned for a while after this destruction. Now, this finding is consistent with the Bible's account in Judges. Judges chapter 9, verses 46 through 49 tells how Abimelech burns down the temple of El Berith in Shechem with about 1,000 men, women, and children locked inside the temple. Archaeologists also discovered a rebuilding period that was well underway by 930 BC. Repairs to city walls, new floors, and evidence of two-story houses, which are typical in Israel during this time period. This rebuilding appears to have begun during Solomon's reign, but continued and was completed during Jeroboam's reign. Archaeological evidence suggests that the city was destroyed again in 724 BC by the Assyrian invasion of Israel. It appears from archaeological records that the city was abandoned for about 400 years after the Assyrian invasion. Archaeological evidence indicates that the city was rebuilt again around 330 to 207 BC, which coincides with the Hellenistic period. During this time frame, a temple was built by the Samaritans on Mount Gerizim. Jewish historian Josephus records in his Jewish War that in 113 BC, John Hyrcanus, the first Jewish Hasmonean leader, began an extensive military campaign against Samaria. In 111 BC, his army attacked and destroyed the city of Shechem and destroyed the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans at Shechem were enslaved. The city never recovered from this destruction, and it laid in ruins until identified by Tersch in 1901. In 72 AD, in attempt to suppress the Samaritan efforts to rebuild the temple on Mount Gerizim, The Romans built a new city that they called Flavia Neapolis, about 1.5 miles west of the ruins of Shechem, actually in the plains in between the two mountains there. In the 7th century AD, Muslims conquered the city and they renamed it Nablus. So this is a list of the archaeological studies that were done at Shechem. In 1903, a group of German scholars under the direction of Hermann Tersch examined what was called then Tel Balata. They uncovered the west wall of the ruins and concluded it was ancient Shechem. In 1913 and 14, just before World War I, another group of Germans, led by archaeologist Ernest Sellen, began excavations along the city wall, but their efforts were cut short by World War I. They began work again in 1926 and worked for 10 years. Unfortunately, Sellen's house in Berlin was bombed in 1943 during World War II, and most of his records were lost. What was left was not well organized. He was able to report the findings of the temple and some Canaanite and Israeli artifacts, which reinforced Tersch's earlier conclusion that the site was Shechem. In 1956, American archaeologists George E. Wright and Bernard Anderson continued excavations at Shechem until 1962. Wright uncovered the earliest structures at Shechem, which dated to 1850 BC, and this would support the idea that Shechem was not a city at the time Abraham arrived in Canaan, but became a city a few decades later. Wright also discovered several destruction layers in the city and the temple. In 1973, the American archaeologist William G. Dever discovered a rebuilding period that was well underway by 930 BC. Repairs to the city walls, new floors, evidence of two-story houses, which were typical in Israel during this period. This would be during the time frame of the rule of Jeroboam in the northern kingdom of Israel. There it goes, okay. So this is a map of the archaeological site at Shechem as it was seen in 1956 by George Wright and his team. Edward Campbell of Wright's team made the map. This map shows Tel Balata in the center here. The city of Shechem was at Tel Balata. Right of the map is the proposed tomb of Joseph, which is here, and the well of Jacob is down here. So you can see those three major biblical events all occurred in that area. Mount Gerizim is not on the map. It's off the map, and it would be up here in the left, and Mount Ebal would be up here to the right. This is an area view of Shechem as it looked like in 1999. There's a gate in the upper left-hand corner here within the gate, or within the wall. There's another gate in the lower right here. This is the temple, the El Berith, Baal El Berith here. This right here is what remains of a standing stone that we believe that Joshua put up. Of course, not seen in the photo is Mount Gerizim, which again is up here, and Mount Ebal, which is over here. This is the standing stone at Shechem. It's 4.5, almost 5 feet wide. It's 1.5 feet thick, and although it's broken at the top, it's about 5 foot high. Several American archaeologists believe that this is the standing stone that Joshua put in place at Shechem, which is mentioned in Joshua chapter 24, verses 26 and 27. If it is, then it's also the pillar that's mentioned in Judges chapter 9, verse 6, under which Abimelech was made king. I mentioned on that map Jacob's Well. These are photos of Jacob's Well, which were taken in 1913, just prior to World War I. The photo on the left is of a woman drawing water from the well, and you can see that she has an overhead cover. The picture on the right shows the well from outside the cover. The well is just to the left of the man that's standing on the staircase. So this is this cover here is right there. In 384 AD, a church was built over the site, but the church was destroyed in 484 AD by the Samaritans. Somewhere between 527 and 565 AD, Justinian I, the Byzantine Roman emperor, rebuilt a church over the well, and this church was destroyed around 800 AD by the Muslims. In 1175 AD, another Greek Orthodox church was built over the site, but it too was destroyed by the Muslims in 1187 AD. Somewhere before 1940, construction of a fourth Greek Orthodox church was begun over the site. The construction was completed in 2007. I think I got a couple of pictures here. So this is a picture of that fourth Greek Orthodox church as it was still undergoing construction in 1970. You can see that there's no roof on it, on the structure yet. This was about 30 years into the construction period, and another 30 years before it was complete. The two structures that look like porta potties, they cover staircases that go down underground into where the well's located. And I have a after picture. This was taken just this year, actually just a few months ago. You can see the two staircases that go down. That was covered by the porta potties in the 1970s picture. And you can tell that the Greek Orthodox, they do it right. Very colorful. This is a photo of Joseph's tomb, which was taken in, again, 1913, just prior to World War I. It lies a few hundred feet east from Tel Balata and about 1,000 feet northwest from Jacob's Well. The structure that you see here was built in 1868. Between 2009 and 2010, the tomb was refurbished with a new cupola installed. However, the tomb was vandalized by Palestinian rioters in 2015 and again in 2022. And again, I got a recent photo of it. This is a photo of how that tomb looks today. So this is a summary of Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 through 7. We talked about the great tree or oak tree or rabbinith tree or plains of. My preference is for the plains of. We talked about that Moriah had three different Hebrew definitions depending on what it was talking about. If you were talking about agriculture, it was an early rain. If you're talking about a person, it means a teacher. In the absence of those two, it can mean instruction, and I prefer the plains of instruction. We talked about several important biblical events that occurred at Shechem. It's important to note that, when we study events that occur in the Bible, we tend to look at those events in isolation, or we look at the event before it and the event after it, and we look to see, what significance that event had in the history. We rarely look at biblical events based on the perspective of the place where they occurred. But if you take those 7 biblical events that occurred at Shechem, they all had one thing in common, and that was promises made, kept, broken. And the constant theme there was God's promises, which were made at Shechem, were kept and fulfilled, but promises made by man were often broken. I've showed you and talked a lot about the archaeology of Shechem, and it all supports the Bible's claims on the events that happened there. The Amarna letters support Joshua's conquest, and important from an archaeological perspective, it helps date that conquest. And when we get into Bethel, I'll talk more about why that's important. And you saw their proposed sites for Jacob's well. Jacob is misspelled on my slide, I just found out. And Joseph's tomb. Any questions about that before we move on? Because we're about to move on to a different verse and different locations. Dave?
One thing bothers me about this is that you talk about Shechem and never been in any battle and showing them something aligned with people, but according to the Bible, they were told to utterly destroy and not make any alliances with them. They did make an alliance with a group to their sorrow. They had to keep. Was that Shechem?
They kept alliances at Shechem, and as Judges, the verse in Judges points out, the people of Shechem actually joined them in the reading of the law when that reading occurred on Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. So they were friendly to them, and as a result, the city itself was not destroyed, but it was under control of the Israelis. Now, the Bible tells us that there were 3 places that were utterly destroyed during the conquest. One of them is Ai, which we'll be talking about later this morning. One of them was Hazor, and the other one was Jerusalem. All 3 of them were destroyed by fire. The other cities that were conquered were not destroyed by fire. And as you pointed out, in many of the cases, in those 3 cases, everyone, man, woman, child, everything was destroyed and killed. But in the other places, the people were not necessarily killed, whole lot exterminated. Sometimes they were enslaved. Sometimes they were allowed to go in peace. Any other questions about Shechem before we move on? Okay, got about another 20 minutes. Okay, that's good. So this is literally the next verse. From there, and I put in parentheses Shechem, just to remind everyone what we're talking about. From there, he went on, he being Abraham, went on towards the hills east of Bethel and placed his tent with Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So from those verses, we have 2 place names. We have Bethel and we have Hai. In Hebrew, the Ai is pronounced with an H, so Hai is the Jewish pronunciation. Before I move on, I want to point out that the identification of the city west of Abram as Bethel is an anachronism. I pointed out a few weeks ago another anachronism. I think it was Ashur, the city of Ashur, was an anachronism. You may recall from the first week of the class that anachronism is a thing or a name that is appropriate to one time period, but not to the time period to which it is mentioned. At the time that Abram arrived, the place that is being called Bethel wasn't called Bethel at that time, it was called Luz. How do we know that? Well, in Genesis chapter 35, so 23 chapters from now, it tells us that the place was called Luz at the time of Jacob, which is 200 years later, and that, 200 years after Abraham, and that the name was changed by Jacob to Bethel. Bethel meaning Beth, meaning house, El meaning God, so meaning the house of God. So using that name at this particular time is an anachronism. Why is that important? It's not necessarily important here at this particular time and place, but when we get to the Exodus, it becomes very important. So every time this occurs, I'm going to point out, hey, this is an anachronism. Moses uses anachronisms in his writing to help his readers understand what place they're talking about. And when we get to the Exodus, I'll explain why that's important. So these are the two sites. The archaeological sites for Bethel and Ar are very complicated and controversial, primarily because these sites were initially misidentified in the 19th century. The initial proposed sites met some of the biblical requirements, but they did not meet all of them. As a result, many biblical critics use the data from the initial proposed sites to claim that the Bible was in error and that it was in error about the Israeli conquest. There are two outcomes that came out of the misidentification of these two sites. One of them was that there was a group of archaeologists which came out and said, okay, well, the archaeology doesn't support the Bible at all, and therefore the Bible is myth and legend. It's not history, you can't trust it. Archaeology doesn't support it. So that's one group. There's another group that said, well, no, the Bible is essentially accurate. It's just that the dating is wrong, and we don't understand the Bible dating, so the Exodus didn't really occur in the 15th century AD. It really occurred in the 12th century AD, and now everything fits. So what they tried to do was change the Bible to fit the archaeology rather than saying, oops, there's a problem with the archaeology. It's not right. We got to find something else. So those two, for 150 years, archaeologists have been on those two, not all archaeologists, some archaeologists have been on those two streaks going about how the Bible is in error. And that is a result of Bethel and Ai and the archaeology from the two misidentified sites. However, two new sites have been proposed over the last 30 years that do meet the biblical requirements for Bethel and Ai. Like I said, this is a complicated situation. I'm going to try to simplify it. I may actually oversimplify it. If you have questions, stop me and ask, because there's a lot of misinformation which I'm just leaving out. You may have noticed by now that I've added a third place name to this list. I put it in parentheses, and that's Beth Aven. And the reason that I added it to this list is because you really can't identify Bethel and Ai unless you also identify Beth Aven at the same time. Beth Aven is mentioned along with Bethel and Ai in the book of several times in the book of Joshua. So let's look at what the biblical requirements are for Bethel and Ai and Beth Aven. And the next couple of slides are cartoons, if you will, that I've drawn up to help explain what the Bible requirements are for both Bethel, Ai, and Beth Aven. According to Genesis chapter 12, verse 8, Abram pitched his tent on the hills being plural, with Bethel on his west and Ai on the east. Also note that Joshua 7:2 states that Ai is east of Bethel. So I've drawn Bethel here as a circle, Ai as a circle. The circle for Ai is smaller because later in Judges, it tells us that Ai is a small fortress compared to another fortress that Gibeon. And so I've drawn it as a small circle. And I've tried to draw a tent here on hills, H plural, and this is where Abraham would have camped. Bethel on his west, Ai on his east. And I've got a little compass point here to help point that out. So that's one biblical requirement. According to Genesis, According to Genesis 12:8, oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing. Joshua 7:2 also states that Ai is next to or beside Beth Aven. Joshua 18:12 through 13 imply that Bethel is southwest of Beth Aven. So I've drawn Beth Aven here near Ai, and with Beth Aven being northeast of Bethel. Joshua chapter 8, verse 9 and verse 12 states that there's an ambush site just west of Ai that can't be seen by those in Ai. Now, this could be a valley that's next to a ridge, or it could be a thick wooden place, but it's got to be a place where a fairly large group of people, about 3,000, can hide that can't be seen by Ai. And so I've drawn that ambush site right here. Joshua 8:11 implies that there's a militarily significant hill north of Ai with a valley between the hill and the city of Ai. The city gate of Ai should be in the north. So what Joshua did during the Battle of Ai was actually there were two battles of Ai. The first battle of Ai, he sent some scouts, Joshua sent some scouts up there. Let me back up. Before the Battle of Ai at Jericho, they were told to destroy everything and leave everything there. Don't take anything with you. And they destroyed Jericho, but certain things were taken from Jericho that should not have been taken. And so Joshua sent some scouts up to Ai. They scouted out. He says, it's not a very big place. With about 3,000 people, we could go take it. So Joshua sent 3,000 people up there, 3,000 men to go take it, and they were utterly defeated. Well, and after that great battle of Jericho, why would God just dump them? Why would God just ignore them, allow them to be defeated at Ai? And God pointed out that some people did what they were told not to do, so Joshua went back into camp, found out that yes, indeed, there were people that had taken things they weren't supposed to take. The Israelites had them put to death, and now this is battle 2. This is the second battle for Ai that I'm about to describe. So Joshua sends a group of men up here in an ambush site that, like I said, cannot be seen by Ai, and he puts them there the night before the battle. Then Joshua and his main force comes up to this hill, allows himself to be seen. The men of Ai see him. So as they start to go down the hill and into the valley, the men of Ai rush out of the city to go to attack them, and Joshua withdraws, retreats back up to the top of the hill. Well, while the men are chasing them back up to the top of the hill, this ambush force comes around, goes into the city, and burns it to the ground, according to the Bible. And when the men of Ai turn around and see that their city's burning, they give up, and Joshua conquers the city, kills all the men, women, and children inside the city, and burns it to the ground. So that is the biblical requirement for the location of Bethel, Ai, and Beth Aven. Just to orient you to the location here, this is the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is up here off the map. This is Jerusalem here. This is Shechem, where Abraham left and went south to go to Bethel and Ai, which would be right here. This is roughly 10 to 12 miles north of Jerusalem. I'd like to point out that this is a very important strategic military site. There's a road going from Jericho right up here through Ai into Beth Aven, east-west road. There's a north-south road going from Shechem through Bethel and Beth Aven into Jerusalem. This is hill country, and you can literally stand in Ai and see Jerusalem. So it's line of sight. If an attack were to occur at Ai, they could signal the folks at Jerusalem saying, hey, there's an army coming down. And so Ai was a northern outpost for Jerusalem. This is a closer up map. It's a topographical map. This was hard to find, but I did eventually find it. And I need to point out a few things. So this is El Bira. It is the new proposed site for Bethel. The old proposed site for Bethel was up here at Betin. Betin is the new proposed site for Beth Aven. This is at Tel. This was the old proposed site for Ai. This and this did not meet the biblical requirements for both Bethel and Ai. This is the new proposed site for Ai. Please note, there are hills, plural, in between Bethel and Ai. Ai is east of Bethel. Bethel is west of Ai. Beth Aven is close to Ai. This is the ridge Joshua stood on. This is the valley that they went down. The men of Ai went out into the valley and chased them up this hill. And I'll show you later a picture of the ambush site, which lies right about here. So Et Tel was the original proposed site for Ai. It was proposed in 1924. Of course, in 1995, archaeologists began to recognize El Makatar, this site here, as the new Ai. Until 1999, no site had been proposed for Beth Aven because they were still considering Betin as Bethel, and this is Ai, and there's just no place up here that fit for Beth Aven. Okay, noted. In 1995, a group of archaeologists with the Association of Biblical Research was able to propose Betin as Beth Aven. Since the bell rang, this may be a good place to pause and come back next week and talk about Bethel and Ai and questions.
This might be something you're going to cover next week. So what made the archaeologists decide to change? Was it just the fact that they fit the original definition?
So with the original definition of Betin as Bethel and Et Tel as Ai, they didn't meet the biblical requirements. As a result, a prominent archaeologist came up with actually two different theories. One theory being that the Bible's just a myth, okay? Because archaeology is proving that the Bible is wrong. And the other one was, well, no, the Bible's essentially right, but the timelines are wrong. And so instead of being a 15th century conquest, it's a 13th century conquest. For 150 years, that had been going on, and as a result, there have been arguments all back and forth about what's going on. Well, a group of archaeologists in the 1900s AD began to realize, well, it can't be the Bible, it's the archaeology that's wrong. And if it's Bethel and Ai that's causing all the problems, then the archaeology of Bethel and Ai has got to be what's wrong. So this group from our Associates of Biblical Research, started looking, okay, where could Bethel be, where could Ai be, and they found these sites, and we're going to talk about next week more about that. But that misidentification caused a tremendous amount of turmoil with regard to biblical archaeologists. Any other questions? If not, let's get ready for services.